Hello and welcome to the Emotional Work Podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And my guest today is someone that we've been chatting, I think for about 5 months, about having a conversation about the topic we're going to talk about today. So I'm delighted that I finally got my finger out and actually done something about it and organised an opportunity to chat with our guest today. I'm a bit nervous about chatting with our guest because she's this virtual digital kind of interaction queen, and because we're recording this podcast virtually, then I'm a bit kind of gotta make sure I do well, must make sure I do all the right things. And I suppose because of the topic we're talking about today, that also links into why I'm a little bit nervous. Anyway, enough about me. Let's get our guest on the air. So I'd like to welcome to the Emotional Work Podcast Joe Cook. Hi Joe.
Hello. I've got the biggest grin and I'm just laughing at that introduction because thank you so much, but also you're brilliant at what you do, so I don't really see that you need to worry about me at all.
Well, it's one of those. So the topic we're talking about today is digital body language, and I can't see each other. So one of the things that I do with all of the podcasts that I record virtually is I only do it on an audio only call, so I don't do the video bit, because what I've experienced in the past is if you have the video bit, it sounds the interaction changes because we can see each other, but the audience can't see you and the audience can't see me. So I do it with the cameras off to make it an actual conversation rather than us talking on video where we would pick up other cues. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes perfect sense to me, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about.
What we're talking about, yeah. All right, so we won't go down there yet. We'll hold that, because as always, we start the Emotional Work Podcast with an innocuous yet unexpected question. And I had one in my head before I pressed the record button, and it completely disappeared. And then Joe mentioned something. I thought, yes, that's what we'll do. That question will work. So my innocuous yet unexpected question is, what was the last thing you talked to your hairdresser about?
I knew I shouldn't have joked about my new haircut. What was the last thing I talked to her about? Probably something about exercise.
Okay.
Because she's been getting into running, and she runs a lot over the winter and Christmas. And I like swimming, and it's all about health and what's right for you. And if anybody's met me, they know that I'm definitely not a runner. But it's about what's right for individuals in terms of their own, whatever their goals are for fitness. And so we were probably talking about that and healthy eating, something along those lines.
Okay. So I similarly had my haircut on Saturday. But even though I was having my haircut, the whole conversation was about my son, Joseph, who was also having his haircut at the same time. So he was sat in the chair next to me. So there's four chairs in the barber's that I go to, and he was sat in the one next to me, and he'd taken a book into the chair to read. And both the lady that was cutting his hair and the lady that was cutting my hair were both talking about his reading. So the one cutting his hair was talking to him about it and kind of helping him with the book, and the other one was talking to me about it, saying, how old is he, and what does he like to read, and all that sort of stuff. So I would love to say it was all about me, but it wasn't. It was nothing to do with me.
What I found funny about my haircut, because I've gone from really long to a bit shorter to proper short. And my hairdresser cut it and did everything and styled it. And she gave me the mirror to look in, and I kind of went, yeah, that's good, looking around. And I went, can we go a bit shorter? And she just nodded like, I knew you were going to say that.
I'm tempted to turn the camera on now so I can see your super short hair, but I won't do that. I will resist the temptation. I'll save that one for off air. All right, so we haven't got that video kind of channel then, so we haven't got the opportunity to see each other, which we said earlier on links into the topic of conversation that we're going about today. Now, I think digital body language is a really massive topic. It spans lots of different areas, but I guess I want to clarify what digital body language is or might be. So should we start there? What would you or what working definition do you use to kind of describe what digital body language is?
So there's a few different ways you could look at this topic. One is from kind of the roots of the term, if you like. So Steve Woods was was very much kind of instrumental in using this term digital body language. And the way he explains it on his blog is it's the aggregate of all the digital activity you see from an individual. And he goes on to say that's emails that are opened and clicked, websites visited, Google searches, referrals from social media, webinars attended, all sorts of different things. So that's very much from a data and a marketing point of view.
Okay.
And that's really great because you can use that in your learning management system, your e-learning design, your MOOCs, whatever it is that you're doing around your content and your delivery, you can use that information to analyze people's behavior around what they're doing in work, in communication, in applying these things and make adjustments. So I think that's a good starting point. I develop it on from there. Okay.
So you said there were 3, I think. So did you say there were 3 kind of routes?
I might have done. So that's the main one in terms of digital body language. The second one is taking it from that marketing aspect and looking at that from a learning lens, if you like, around the content.
Yeah, okay.
I think the third area for me, and this is where I really concentrate on it, is it's about doing something different from face-to-face communication. Like you're saying, we don't have our video one right now. So we're having a different type of conversation from face to face. So most people will know that I focus on webinars, virtual classrooms, and the other stuff that goes with that. And in modern learning, that includes communities and social media and so on. So actually, digital body language is about all of those things as well. And how can we do that really well so that we don't just go, we're not in the same room together, therefore it's not as good.
Okay, because you did a podcast recently with the lovely folk at Good Practice, which was
I did.
Why are all webinars rubbish? I think was
something like that.
Was the working title, and that was what prompted me to then kind of pick up my phone and DM you and say, we must get that digital body language thing booked in, because I guess, and I'm not a person to create the definitions by any way, but that big broad one in terms of the digital persona that we create, based on the sites we visit, the stuff we buy, the things we retweet, the likes we give on Facebook, and all of those things, and aggregating that up to create a persona for somebody. Because when I think about digital body language, that phrase takes me, I think similarly to you, into the how can we interpret people's stance or sentiment or position or perspective on things when we are communicating with them digitally. So I'm interested in the active bit, whether it be through a webinar, through a MOOC, through
through social media,
through social media, all of that stuff. And, so Mark. That Mark Gilroy on Twitter and I had a conversation, I think offline a while ago, about emoji use, and what do emojis tell us about individuals and all that sort of stuff as well. So
that comes into it, absolutely.
Because when I was researching the term, I like you found all this stuff about that kind of broader digital persona aspects, which is unbelievably fascinating, and that was arguably what the if I may get slightly political for a moment, that's what the likes of Cambridge Analytica do or did before they went bust, or bust, should I say, in inverted commas. You can't see me doing that inverted commas, but bust.
No, I can't.
But that's in terms of building that overall perspective and persona on or about the individual, to try and then use that to determine what they're like.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's a lot about the detail as well. So in Steve Woods' blog, he says, in the same way that body language, as read by salesperson managing a deal, it's an amalgamation of facial expressions, body posture, eye motions, and many other small details. Digital body language is the amalgamation of all digital touch points. And certainly from the data and the analysis part, it really can be about drilling down into that detail. So yes, it's about aggregating up, but also it's about drilling down. So I think those two aspects of the data part of it are really interesting too.
So aggregating up to a persona, and then where does the drilling down take you then? Drilling down into, is that like user experience? Is that where that's going?
Yeah, I think you can get into user experience, user design, customer service, and it goes into, that's where the detail comes in. And that could be analysis from a data point of view of dumping everything into a spreadsheet and what comes out. Or I think it could also be really manual analysis. So I've been doing some analysis on the training journal webinars recently that we run, all sorts of different stuff. And I haven't got the greatest amount of data and the greatest depth of data, but just by exporting what I do have and looking at it either through a spreadsheet or just looking at what's available to me. So one of the things that came up was the amount of chat messages in a session. So on the #TJWow sessions, there'll be 200 messages of public chat, for instance. And it was just interesting about, what does that mean? Does more chat mean actually people are more engaged because they're typing away in the chat window? Or does less chat mean they're more engaged because they're sitting back and listening and taking it in? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's a really interesting level of detail to get to.
And do you also have any data to talk about or to try and assess the experience that, or the rating of that webinar? As, do people kind of, and that's not necessarily filling in a survey, because I don't, I'm not a massive fan of surveying everything, the life out of everything. But in terms of, so is that, because there's lots of, like you said, sorry, my head's gone off in lots of different directions about.
we are jumping on the data train here, and I'm not sure that was your intention.
No, that's okay. I don't mind that though. But where my head is going is the number of different things that could affect that data. So that could just be that could be about the structure of the webinar. So did this, because if presuming that you use a similar format for the TJ Wow webinar, you host plus multiple guests, and then audience participation is through the chat. If you have a guest who encourages chat window use, by saying, like, for example, I'd like to hear what other people think about that. Pop it in the chat window and let us know what you think. Versus guests that discourage, well, maybe discourage isn't the right word, because you wouldn't say, I don't want to hear from you, please don't put that in the chat window.
They definitely would not do that.
But you've got kind of active encouragement versus passive contribution type thing, because that again could affect the
absolutely, and in the way that I manage that. So if there's a webinar, this is where I don't have this data and I haven't done this analysis. But what we could do is look through either a sample or a range and just go, well, okay, how many times in a webinar did Joe read out a comment from the chat window as part of the whole flow of facilitating? And on this webinar, it was 13 times. And on this webinar, it was 28 times. What does that mean? Was there a difference in the amount of chat? Because people thought, she's reading stuff out. It's valuable, therefore I'll type something. Or she's reading stuff out and she scared me off, so I'm not going to type something. This is the interpretation, and this is the same with any body language. I was chatting to somebody the other day, and I was really aware that I basically had my arms crossed, and so many people interpret that as a barrier. I don't know you, I don't like you, I don't trust you. But it wasn't. It was, my shoulder's uncomfortable, I'm now sitting more comfortably. So it's down to interpretation a lot of the time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever in the behaviour analysis work that I do, I can, so the gold, one of the golden rules that kind of I was introduced to in the early days that I still abide to is, you can see things and you can hear things, but you never know why. So I was facilitating a design sprint last week, so 5-day kind of Google design sprint methodology last week, and on Thursday, one of the members of the team was different. Momentary moments of looking sad, less engaged than they had been before, less certain in their statements, more kind of, there was more hedging, more ums and ers and maybes and possiblies and sort ofs and sort of pre-exclusion qualifiers, that sort of thing. So as we went for coffee, I went out for a walk with that person, and as I was walking along next to them, I just said, how you getting on today? I've got a lot on. I said, okay, well, I just want you to know that if there's stuff that you need to do, then I'd rather you do what you need to do to make sure you're okay, and then you can come back and re-engage in the sprint whenever you're ready. Please don't feel obliged to be here if you've got other stuff that's on your mind. If I'm going to have you in the room, I want all of you in the room, not part of you in the room. And if that can, if one way we can help that is by you going and taking some time and doing what you need to do and then coming back, then that's fine by me, type thing. And then when I closed the session on Friday, that participant came and found me and said, I was so grateful for that. And then she told me everything that was happening and going on, which I didn't know, and I know I couldn't know about. But what I can see is the change in her style, the change in the way that she was going about interacting with the session. So you're right. We can gather the data. We can try and infer some possible things, but we've got to be hypothesizing away about what that could be. So yes, there was, if Joe mentions in the chat this, then this happens to the chat window, or this happens to the number of chat contributions. But that doesn't mean that you reading out a chat always equals. You reading out a post always equals more chat contributions.
And I think that's the joy and the nuance of the focus that you and I place on digital body language a bit more, is less about the numbers and the data and the analysis of looking at an LMS or whatever it might be, and more about in the moment in a webinar or a virtual classroom or on some kind of social discussion, whether that's Slack or Yammer or Twitter or LinkedIn, whether that's live or asynchronous, sort of based over time. What's going on for people? What can I notice? What can I pick up? And this for me is an absolutely key skill. Our lives are becoming much more social. Our communication is much more electronic and remote, but it shouldn't necessarily be distant physically as well as psychologically.
Yes, absolutely. And is it... I'm now thinking back through my personal experiences. I'm trying to work out if it's easier or more difficult to inquire as to what's happening or what's going on for an individual. So I can think of a Twitter chat that happened. I can't remember how many years ago it was now. A number it was on the tradition. So on let's do shameless plug time. So there's a Twitter handle called L&D. So the letter L, the letter N, the letter D connect. And the L&D community is a non-for-profit organisation who run wicked and fantastic face-to-face events in terms of unconferences, but also they run Twitter chats. And one of those Twitter chats is on a Friday morning between 8 and 9 UK time, and it's called LD Insight. And I remember there was a one chat in particular where one of the participants was quite different from how they would normally be. So the contributions were much more challenging. They were quite accusatory at times. And I was reading their contributions thinking, that's different. That's changed from how that person would normally be. And again, I didn't know why. So I moved over to the DM option in Twitter and just sent a separate message saying, notice that, no, I can't remember how I framed it now. I did my best to make it, again, non-accusatory, but it's something along the lines of, notice that, your interaction seems a bit different to normal. Is everything okay? I think was something. It would be something along that line. But yeah, so my question that I began that with, I suppose, was, if you were on, say, a webinar or Slack or wherever, is it easier or more difficult to contact somebody and say, I notice you're different, is everything okay?
I think, like with anything, it depends on the relationship you have with someone. So I had a not so recent experience, but something similar on a public webinar that I was hosting, and there were 80 or 100 people in the chat panel. And like you say, somebody was being different. Actually, they were being very quiet, which they weren't normally. And I had privately messaged and just said, hey, how are you doing today? Hope you're okay. Or words to that effect. I said something like, you're different today. Are you okay? Words to that effect. And the response I got back was, in my terms, blimey, how did you know? Just from this public webinar chat. And like you say, it's like, you're different from normal. Now, because I've got a relationship with that person, I could pick that up. If I didn't have the relationship with that person, I wouldn't have known that, because you have to have the previous experience to contrast that with. So by having the previous experience to contrast it with, that means I have some kind of relationship, and therefore I can approach that in some way.
Yeah, one of the things that I do a lot is build what I call baselines for people. So what's their typical behaviour in this context? Yeah, so there you go. I've managed to get 19 minutes into the podcast before I mentioned context. I've done well. What's that person's typical behaviour in this particular environment or in this context, and that differs from face to face to online. Actually, differs across different social media channels as well. So one person's baseline on Twitter can be different to Facebook and can be different to Slack or somewhere else. But it's building that baseline and then making a contrast between. And one of the challenges that I find on the webinars that I run is often the people I'm meeting I've never met before. So building a baseline for them is really tricky because I haven't got that. That past experience to contrast it with.
Is you don't always meet these people. You don't always know them. So instantly, I don't know. The term in my head, Phil, was you're falling into a trap, and I don't know if that's accurate.
Yeah.
Also then kind of going, well, I don't have a face-to-face relationship with you before, so immediately I'm either disadvantaged or it's different. But that's the reality of a lot of the work that we're doing.
Yeah. So the implication then, I think, in what you just said was that face-to-face is more valuable than virtual in terms of an environment to have or make or build a relationship. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's the inference I picked up. Do you think is that fair?
I think.
As in, is that, or am I accurate in my inference?
I think that's what I picked up from you and was reflecting back to you. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Good. In that case, yes.
Okay, because I disagree with that. I don't think maybe that's an Outlook thing, as in not like a Microsoft Outlook because that's awful, but as in a perspective Outlook thing, because some really strong relationships that I've got now were first made online and then moved offline. Which I never thought would happen. I remember, I think I might have shared this on the podcast once before, I can't remember. But I was walking across, I was in Farringdon. I'd just gone to an amazing place that does these like 250 different varieties of tea with Meg Pepin, Joe Wainwright and Fiona McBride. And we were walking across it was a really wonderful kind of catch up. And then we were walking across the road to a pub because that's what you do after tea. You have beer. And as we walked over, I think it was Joe said to me, "So we're friends now." And I don't know how long ago this was now. It must be at least 4 if not 5 years ago. And my response was, "I don't know. I think so." I said, "What do you mean I don't know?" I said, "Well..."
Yeah, way to go, Phil. Well done.
Yeah, I know. Here's a shovel. Can you dig it, fool? But it was the first, because they were the first people that I'd met online and then met offline and spent some time with. And so there are a few things that were coming together. One was I have a thing about kind of who I call friends, because the word friend means something different to me, I think, than so the word friend means to me is someone that I know really well, I absolutely trust and would happily talk to about stuff. Mm-hmm. And that might be different to other, so at that point in time, I guess, in my head, there were a couple of things I was struggling with. One was, I don't know if I know you well enough for you to fit into my category of friend, in terms of what I call friend as. But also, I'd never made friends in that way before. That it wasn't something, that meeting and chat with somebody online, then taking it offline and building, making a friendship online and then carrying it on offline was something I hadn't done before. And that's the one, and then I came up with a nickname of the word "tan," which is my Twitter associate network. So I then, in an attempt to dig myself out of the hole, I try to play with humour, and so, well, that's okay. You're just part of my tan, and you're some tans to me, because you're part of my Twitter associate network. But I can't even remember where I started with this. But anyway, it's. Yeah,
it's online versus offline. I think is really interesting. Yeah. I interviewed or chatted with Jeff Kortenbosch from IKEA on my podcast recently. So all about virtual classrooms, the Lightbulb Moment podcast, and he's been running some virtual classroom and webinar sessions, and just a handful of them. So I really wanted to get sort of some fresh insight from somebody. And one of the interesting things he'd said was how different it is, the experience of people when they've met online first in a webinar, for instance, and then they meet in an office. Maybe they've travelled to another office or another shop, and then they meet someone face to face. They're almost like they're walking past and they go, "Oh, you're so-and-so from the webinar the other day." And he was explaining what a different reaction it is rather than the people we already know and we happen to be on a webinar with. So again, it's about relationships and this whole digital body language thing when we're talking about moderating, facilitating, getting to know people is all about building relationships, whether that's in a webinar for 60 minutes, in a virtual classroom for 5 sessions, on social media for however long. It's about building those relationships. And it was just really interesting what Jeff was saying about the difference between whether you'd met someone face-to-face previously or not.
Yeah, and I see similar experiences of that at sort of tweet-ups or get-togethers. When either whether that be at events or just generally organised tweet-ups where people say, right, we're going to be in this pub at this time, and whoever comes along, and you go, oh, it's you, and when you recognise somebody from the avatar, or when that it's a different whereas if you were just attending and you were meeting somebody for the first time that you've not met before, it would be. But then you've got that shared experience, haven't you? You've got the shared experience of knowing each other and conversing online first before you then take it offline as well. Yeah.
So that goes back to building relationships. And that's why digital body language is important in today's society, but also our working life, is because a lot of people, depending on their roles and companies, are attending Skype meetings or Microsoft Team meetings or whatever it might be. And whether that's video on or video off, you've got to get to grips with people. I'm chairing a session at Online Educa Berlin, a couple of sessions. And in one Skype conversation with no video, we had literally 15 minutes for 4 of us or 3 of us to get to know each other, get comfortable with each other, talk through the details and the logistics on what we were going to do, and get offline again. I mean, how do you do that in 15 minutes with no video and only audio? This is digital body language and being professional and being a good communicator and all of those things.
And so I just want to sort of take us down that video route for a while. So I did some work with a multinational communications company recently, and one of the things that came out through the exploratory discussions I had, was that whenever people Skyped each other, the default setting, not the default setting of the application, the default setting of the function I was working with, was video off. Now, the reason, and I've done my inverted commas again, and I hope I communicated that in my pronunciation of the reason that was given for that, was bandwidth. Yet when I forced it to happen, when I said, no, if you're coming, I was running sessions that were where people were physically present and they were virtually present as well. So I had one session where I had a group together with me in one country, and then 3 other countries at the end of a laptop, and we were all working together, working our way through what ostensibly was a face-to-face workshop with some people online. And one of my requirements was, if that's going to happen, it's got to be on video. Everybody has to be on video, because audio only just isn't going to work. And the feedback afterwards was how much more valuable it was. but the default setting still remained at we want to do it without video because to save bandwidth. But I think it was actually because it was more comfortable. But I think it, based on the discussions I had with that client in particular, and I haven't done any, I haven't done the investigation into what the research would say, but I would imagine that video is always better than not in terms of building relationships and communication.
So one of the other pieces of work that I've done to complement the digital body language stuff is to look at face-to-face communication and then what this means to the virtual classroom.
Okay.
So what I found was, I'm going to scroll through my own blog on this to see if I can find the detail. I found a study about neural synchronization during face-to-face communication that was in the Journal of Neuroscience. And it was a whole load of scientific stuff in here, which I'm not going to read out. It's all in my blog post to go and read. But basically, the idea was through brain scans and other various different things, the quality of the communication and face-to-face dialogue was basically better. They were saying face-to-face is a better way of communicating for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of measures. And one of the other things in the analysis that they did was it was not only better face-to-face, but actually it was to do with body language. It was to do with also the turn-taking behaviour, the non-verbal communication between participants. Now, this is nothing inspiringly new. Nobody's going to be shocked at this and go, oh my God, that's the most amazing thing ever. But what I found interesting from this is then, well, okay, let's put this in the context of, like you're saying, about that session or webinars or virtual classrooms or online meetings. And what do we miss by not having the video on? Well, what we miss are all of those non-verbal communication parts, the smiles, the air quotes, as you've mentioned, the nodding. But what's then also interesting is if you take that another level is, right, okay, from there, what that would recommend to me is, like you say, let's have webcams on. In a webinar, maybe not, but webcam on me when I'm presenting, some or all of the time, will make a connection with me. If we're doing a virtual classroom with 8 or 10 people, there can be great times where everyone or individuals have their webcam on all the way through or at various points. And there's all sorts of arguments and ways of doing it. And that's another conversation. But the essence is, let's have more face-to-face like conversation. But the other part of this is about the turn-taking behaviour. So there's an element of, well, what we can do actually is take some of these things that we've learned about turn-taking, maybe about verbal communication as well. And I don't have it handy, but I used to quote a piece of research that basically said you can trust people's voice more than you can trust their body language and their facial expressions. And if we're focusing on that part of it, well, actually, we don't need video so much. So what we can do then in a situation like we are today, or if we're on a virtual classroom or something similar, is as long as we're taking turns, as long as we are making sure to follow that etiquette and all of the other good things with our voice, therefore, have people talking in your virtual classroom. Make sure there's time for that and it's not just lecture. That will really improve your communication and your relationship building, and you'll learn a lot from other people. So yes, video is important, but you can look at these things in different ways and apply different things to what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And turn taking itself is a incredibly deeply researched phenomenon. And I'll put I'll take a step back from that and I'll come back to it in a second. So is it possible, Joe, that when we finish, can you ping me over some links to your blog and the different papers that you talked about, or where the papers are found in what you've got? So turn taking is a fascinating phenomena in terms of how people signal end of turns, and the way that the floor or the conversational floor is negotiated is it's just a fascinating thing. And you're right, without that with the non-verbal communication channels missing, it can be harder for people to discern when a turn is finished. So one of the things that two of the strategies that I use. So one is depending on how long the webinar's for or who's involved, then I do a ways of working type thing to say that when that we always need to leave at least a second of pause before someone else comes in, because that way we know that that person has finished. So somebody might sound like they finished, but let them actually finish and just leave a second. That's all it needs to be, to make sure there's nothing else they want to add before somebody else comes in, because there could be a slight delay, there could be there could be something else that's happening. Secondly is I use signposting a lot in terms of where I'm going. So I was running a webinar I did a workshop recently where it was on 2-hour live class, pre-session, 2-day face-to-face together, and then a 2-hour post one discussion. So when it came to the first one, before I sort of fired up the live class, I wrote down the names of all the participants on a grid, and then I had a number of different interactions that I knew I was going to have. So I had introductions was 1, what are you up to at the moment was 2, what are your thoughts on this reading that I gave you was 3, and then there was a 4 and a 5, I can't remember what they were. And then using my grid, I was ticking off when I had contributions from people, and then I would signpost who I was going to next. So for example, I would say, that's so Joe, I'm going to hear from you in a second, but before I do, just to let you know, Jim, I'm going to come to you afterwards, so that person knew, and everybody else knew then kind of who was going to have the floor next and how that was going to work. And then when I'd introduce Jim, I'd then say, right, Jim, we're going to hear from you next, but then after that we're going to go to Kevin, or whatever that might be, so that I was able to set the boundaries of whose turn was coming up and when it was coming up, so that they could both get themselves ready, but also we wouldn't get lots of over talking or interjections from other people as well.
Yeah. And it gives people thinking time and to get over panic and, I've got to unmute my microphone, where's the button again? Because all of those things can be barriers. So that's a really good technique for managing that. And then thinking about the turn taking and putting it into an asynchronous form. So you're on some kind of forum, Facebook group. I see a lot of people in that kind of way, in that form of communication, will type something and it's very me oriented. It's what I think about something or my experience or what I want to say, but there's no turn taking element. So when I'm managing my forum, I really attempt to say, well, here's some information. This is what I think. What do you think? Or versions of that, so that you're encouraging that turn taking, or saying this is just my opinion, you might disagree, or whatever terminology you want to use, because that opens up communication.
Yeah.
And I think that's a text version of being approachable, as opposed to, saying something, going, well, I think it's this. It's very different from going, I think this. What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's got me. So that's a connection I hadn't made before. So that element of and this is a word that sounds a bit dodgy, but I like it. And that's elicitation. So that elicitation of response and information is. And you've used two different, you've identified two different techniques within that you use. One is asking a question, and the second one is leaving option to disagree. There's a number of other techniques as well, but that way of encouraging that interaction, and it links into the podcast I did 2 episodes ago with AD House, talking about communities and how do we get communities sort of vibrant and people engaging and taking part. And part of that is about how do we create the conditions that allow them to feel like it's safe to contribute in whatever way that contribution comes in.
Exactly. And whether that's in your forum, in an email chain, whether that's in a webinar or a virtual classroom, because you don't have necessarily the physical body language or all of the non-verbal cues, or in some cases the voice or the live element of it, what comes across in your words and how you type those, and going back to things like emoticons and emojis, it could be a smiley face at the end of something makes that okay, whereas without it isn't. And that's, again, it's a bigger topic, and actually somebody to look up on that is Esther Barrett, who works for JISC, and she does some really good stuff around the use of emojis and language change. So it's about using those things appropriately in the different forms and getting to know people. There are people that I chat with that are all about the smileys. There are people I email that never do the smileys. There are some people that use the ellipse, the ... on everything. And that drives me mad, because that usually means unfinished sentence, there's more to come, but I'm not saying it, but they don't mean it that way. And as somebody who trained as a journalist, that drives me mental, but that's my issue. Sorry, we didn't come on here to talk about my issues, did we, Phil?
Well, I've talked about my own, so I think the forum is there.
But that's why it's an interesting area, because you can take it so many different ways.
Okay. I see. Now I'm doing the whole kind of over-analysis thing. So I've just done which means I've done I've now signified we're going to change direction and we're going to talk about something different, which implies that I didn't want to talk about I didn't want to pick up on what you were talking about, which isn't the case. I need to just be quiet now. So
have you gone bright pink now, even though I can't see it? I'm hearing it in your voice, Phil.
Don't know what you mean, Joe. Don't know what you mean.
So what else should we talk about, Phil?
Well, one of the things I will do is I'll plug a book. So there's a book called The Human Voice by a lady called Anne Karpf. Anne Karpf is spelled Karpf, and I'll put a link to that to the book in the show notes. And what I love about about that book in particular is it does two things. It talks about I think the word is phenomenology. So it talks about some of the biology aspects of how the voice is produced. So it looks at voice production, from voice box to larynx to mouth to tongue to roof of the mouth and all of those things. So it gives you a breakdown of how the voice is constructed. But then it goes on to talk about what the voice can tell you and what you can notice or attend to in the voice. And I think sometimes there's an over reliance on the words that people use, and we don't pay enough attention to the voice itself, which links back to the point you were making earlier on, that the voice can tell us an awful lot.
Absolutely. And I know I've definitely been on virtual classroom sessions where I'm getting to know people, and they've been on audio. And I remember somebody I heard a breath in, that kind of, I want to say something. And then nothing else came. And so I said, Lisa, or whoever it was, it's like, Lisa, did you want to add something? And she was kind of like, yeah, how did you know I didn't say anything and you can't see me? It's like, well, actually, I just heard you breathe in.
Yeah.
But it was just enough to know, because somebody breathes in that way when they want to say something.
Yeah. And sometimes you can, that, as with a lot of things, you can use that strategically. So if it's mid-conversation and you want to take the floor, often people will negotiate the floor by trying to finish the end of somebody's sentence or to come in really quickly in a gap. But one of the more subtle ways of trying to take the floor is by doing the in-breath, because it sends out that communicative signal to people that there's something you want to say or something you want to add or contribute, which, depending on who's doing the communication, they can either just ignore that completely and carry on anyway, or they might stop mid-sentence and let you in, or they might, at the end of their utterance, they might then say, Phil, was there something you wanted to say or something you wanted to add? And I guess sorry, go on.
See, we've just done it. And speaking of books, I just wanted, I can't remember whether AD mentioned this, but there's a book called Buzzing Communities by Richard Millington. It's not very much, it's like $5 for the Kindle version. And I found that really good when I was starting to work on the community element about communication and how do you read people. It goes into a bit more about building your community and the process of that, but certainly it looks a little bit at this topic area as well.
Yeah, so you recommended that to me for a couple of months ago. Yeah, and I read it. It's good. I agree. It's a good book.
Cool.
Definitely a useful resource. Shameless plug time. Yes, I read it because of setting up the Emotion at Work Hub, which, if you want to join, by the way, go to community.emotionatwork.co.uk and you can sign up for free, and you get access to lots and lots of evidence-based resources on the topic of emotion in the workplace. The shameless plug has now finished. This podcast is brought to you by the Emotional Work Hub. Thank you very much.
And it is really good. I've seen lots of different bits and pieces on there. And it looks really good. Actually, it's really nicely designed as well. And it's really nice to be able to have that stuff that you can trust from someone as well.
Oh, thank you, Joe.
Well, I didn't mean you. I meant the other people writing it. But I'll include you there as well. Okay.
I took the compliment as the curator. That's all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do mean that, of course.
All right. So we earlier on we kind of touched on techniques or strategies that you can use, and we talked about turn taking in terms of signposting and getting some kind of rules of engagement. What other sort of strategies or techniques then do you use either to try and understand somebody's digital body language or to encourage that communication and encourage people in?
There are so many, and it really depends a lot on the type of or the format of whatever it is that you're doing. So webinar, virtual classroom, private group, social media, there's all sorts of different things. I think if we focus on the virtual classroom part of that for a moment, for me, it's all about deconstruct your behaviour and understand it. And this is the difficult thing, I think, when we're going from body language to digital body language, is we understand the concept of I'm looking at your face, hearing your voice, seeing your body language, and I know generally how to interpret that. If you're stepping towards the door, your body is turning that way, probably you want to open the door and get rid of me, so I should finish what I'm saying and get out. But online, we need to learn those new cues. So for me, it's about, okay, what would I normally do face to face? How would I normally understand this? And once I understand that really well, I can then think, well, how could I do that in a virtual sense, in a webinar or a virtual classroom? So it could be, that element of turning towards the door or looking at somebody else and nodding and going, you're next. We can't do that online. But it could be I mute myself and I type, Bob, you're coming up next. Or maybe I move the slide on one, so it's away from the question that I've asked and onto the next topic. And other techniques to basically say, you've had your time, let's move on. On the training journal webinars I host, I generally, if I ask somebody a question, you've been on as the panel a couple of times, you know how this works. Ask a question and say, hey, Phil, what do you think of such and such? And you start saying what you're saying. At which point I'm still listening to you, but I'm reading the chat, I'm looking at the questions, deciding what to ask next, which panel member to go to next, and so on. And at a point where I'm thinking, okay, Phil, you've kind of had the floor long enough, I unmute and I start going, okay. And it's sometimes that works if somebody's in tune with that.
Yeah.
Other times it doesn't, and they just carry on. But that's the case with all body language and interpretation. Yep. With those kind of techniques, and there's loads more, but I'll pause for a second.
No, I think that's really useful, and I like the sending a private message to someone to let them know that you're coming their way as well as a different way of doing it.
Yeah, that's really useful to kind of say, hey, Phil, you're next and the question is about such and such.
Yeah.
Because it gives you thinking time, and you can do that in a webinar where you can't always do that. If, I was chairing at the ELN conference recently, the questions were coming up and the people on the panel all had the planned questions beforehand, but then it was a case of we don't know which one's coming next, we don't know the spin of it, we don't know what's going to come from the floor or how I'm going to interpret a question. And there's no way in a live event for me to type, hey Bob, this is coming next, but there is in an online event. So it's about then, how do you make the most of the technology that you've got?
Yeah, definitely. And do you think that so some of the is that true? No, that's not quite true. So for most of the webinars, or no, that's not true. No, because they're not webinars. They're not omnidirectional.
I love that you're just talking to yourself.
I know. Sorry.
It's just like, I've had a thought. I'm talking out loud. Let's in, Phil. What are you thinking?
So in the virtual classrooms that I facilitate, then, so I do work with the CIPD one of the modules on the L&D, the level 5 L&D qualification is about context. So it's about the context of L&D. So I do a live class on that particular topic. And the setup is me on camera. There's a standard chat window. There's slides and or a whiteboard. And then all of the participants are kind of listed down the side. And one of the things that I work really hard to do is to do my bit, but also follow what's going on in the chat window. So when people are posing questions and so on. But also I've got a facilitator with me who is doing all of what I'm going to now politely describe as the techie stuff. So when I need to shift from the slides to it being a whiteboard, when we move from being whole group to being in in subgroups, so we split people out and put them in sort of what I would describe as syndicate rooms, type thing. They've got their own
breakouts.
Little break. That's the word. There you go. So they do all that techie stuff for me, and I think I'd really struggle to do all of that myself. That is where I'm coming from. The cognitive load of concentrating on the content that I'm kind of paid to talk about, as well as keeping up with the chat window, as well as keeping an eye on time, and then doing all the techie stuff as well. I think I'd find that incredibly difficult. There is one thing I do where I do it all, but there's a slightly different setup because it's everyone else is on camera and stuff as well, so it gives me a bit more. But either way, so I guess where I was going with that was. Is there, and I know we can't unilaterally say yes, you should always have a facilitator. In your experience for virtual classrooms to be effective, does it need two people to take on those two roles, or can one person run it on their own, do you think?
So you've described a really good example of how to run a session like that. The question I have for you on those sessions is how many people are attending?
Roughly 25, 30.
Okay, so this is where the difference between a webinar and a virtual classroom comes in for me. Okay. So a virtual classroom, I would say, is 8 to 10 people max.
Oh, okay.
A webinar is only more than that. So, and it's not that cut and dry. There's always all sorts of considerations to take into account. And I've certainly done sessions at that number of people. But at that number of people, you're not getting to know individuals, you're not getting to build relationships, and you don't have the time to process everything in the same way as you do when you've got half or less than half of that amount of people. So personally, I wouldn't describe that as a virtual classroom.
Okay.
Maybe it's an intimate webinar, and therefore the load on you is different. So in that situation, absolutely, by having a facilitator or a host or a producer, and there's all sorts of different labels you can use, and they can do different parts of the roles with or for you, that really helps, because it helps you concentrate A, on the content, and B, on the people, and not on the technology part of that. You can absolutely run it all on your own. And for 4 of the, 5, 6 years, whatever it is that I've been running Lightbulb Moment, I did it all on my own. I did the whole thing. And yeah, it's challenging, and I didn't always do it very well. And there are limitations, but you can do it. But I was doing that with 8 to 10 people, where you can still build that relationship and you can manage stuff as well as doing the technology. Out of all of the other advantages of having a facilitator, technical facilitator, host, producer, whatever label you want to use, A, there's the technical support. But what I find, so I've trained up Michael, who works with me. I've trained him up to be a producer. He's actually the business operations manager. He's my producer now as well, partly because I wanted him to learn the nuts and bolts of what we actually do in our business. And what I really like about him being my producer is that he will private message me if I've missed something, or if I've interpreted something wrong or differently, let's say. So I've kind of gone, oh, thanks, Bob, for your question. Blah, 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 answer. And actually, Michael will private message me going, I think he meant X. At which point I can choose what to do, but I could say, oh, Bob, maybe you meant such and such, in which case the answer is this, or let's come on microphone, or whatever it might be. And Michael isn't always right. Sometimes, somebody will write, no, you were right the first time, at which point it's like, hey, Michael, I was right.
10 points to me.
But that's exactly. But that's partly because we're siblings, so we can have a bit of a laugh like that. But also, actually, you can have a real laugh. There's somebody I work with as a producer, and we have such a laugh because we've got that private chat. And it's not a laugh at the expense of people. Please don't get that wrong. But it's a laugh at ourselves.
Yeah.
When I do something wrong or she does something wrong and I like, wake up, it's a change of layout time. Or I'm behind time and her favourite phrase is giddy up and stuff like that. So you can still have a real laugh like that. But that's all digital communication. It's all digital body language. So did I answer your question about, do you always need that person?
Yes, so you did, because you said it depends.
Depends on the context, Phil.
Well, there's that word now. So yes, you did answer the question. But you also got me thinking about some other aspects as well, and some of the other variables. So one of the other, so this is part of my elicitation strategies thing. So one of the things that I'll do in the preamble, so I normally go online, say 10-15 minutes before the webinar begins. And then people, you'll always have people that are late, and you'll have people that come in bang on time, and some that are there early. So the ones that are there early, I tend to post questions along the lines of, where in the world are you, or what has surprised you today, or so the class in particular that I do fits just after the group have done their first assignment, so they made their first submission, and I'm like 2 weeks after I think the submission's gone in, and they haven't had their results yet. So I ask questions like, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about the assignments that you submitted? How long is it till you get your marks back? Stuff like that, to try to get the conversation going a little bit early. That then also gives me some insight into the individuals. And again, one of the early activities that I run is about how we can categorize and segment organizations, because there's lots of different things that make up the context for a company, including the sector they work in, how they're structured, what's happening in the big wide world, that sort of thing. So I get people to give me a one sentence summary of where they work, and then what that allows me to do, and this is where my scribbles of paper next to my computer get interesting, where I'm starting to link people up, so that I know that Phil works in a small family orientated organization that provides an IT service to customers, or I know that Joe works in this kind of business. So when I'm then moving through the class and I'm moving through the webinar, should I say, when I'm moving through the webinar and I'm talking about the different aspects, I can start to link that back to not everybody, because there's too many people to do it to everybody, but I work really hard to pay attention to the details of information that people give me, so that I can try and contextualize what I'm talking about in their world. And then it also hopefully demonstrates the desire and willingness to build a connection and a relationship.
Absolutely. That sounds great, because what you're not doing is phoning in your lecture. You're not doing the same session every time that you do that particular session. You've got the bones of topic X, but your nuance is saying, well, actually, that's small business, that's large business, that's that sector, which is going to be different in the next session. And that's exactly how it should be. Whether it's a webinar with 25 people or 2,500 people, there should be a version of that. And this is what we're talking about here, I think, is, again, it's context dependent on the format. Webinar, virtual classroom, social network, public, whatever, is taking what you normally do and adapting it to the technology and the people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we talked. So earlier on, I said what sort of strategies or techniques, and you talked about there's lots of different things you could do in lots of different places. So we started on virtual classrooms, and then I unknowingly or unwittingly took it into webinars. So can I ask a similar question then, but with a webinar head on? What are some of the strategies that you use to help you understand kind of where people are and to try and build a picture of somebody's digital body language. How do you do that in a more of a webinar type setting?
So when you've got more people, it's different. And you could argue it's more difficult because obviously you don't have the individual time. And the people that are more vocal or verbal, whether that's in the chat window or on a whiteboard, less it's going to be verbal speaking in a webinar. They're the ones that you're naturally going to build a better picture of, because if Bob and Alice are always the first to respond, always writing a paragraph, always sharing something, but actually Eve hardly shares anything, naturally you're not going to get to know Eve quite as well. So this is where sometimes the webinar technology can help you. You have to be really careful with the technology parts. Different software does different things. Most of them have a version of how engaged are people, which is usually how much have they clicked in the system, or are they clicked on the system as opposed to clicked onto another piece of software on their computer. That can be useful. So WebEx gives you a red exclamation point next to somebody's name that only the host or the presenter sees when they've clicked on something else. But again, it's interpretation. And this comes to confidence as an example, is are they clicking on something because I'm boring them, or are they clicking on something because I'm saying something that's so amazing and so great that they're making notes about it?
Absolutely.
And I have no idea which one it is. So I choose to interpret it that I'm amazing because that gives me confidence to carry on. So we have to be a bit careful about that, but we do have those cues in the technology to help us. In terms of the webinar, it's still all about the interaction and the turn taking, but that's different. It's less about, here's a question, use chat, use hand up, let's open up microphone and spend 4, 5, 6, 10 minutes discussing this. So it will be much more about using the chat window, but also it's about using whatever technology is there for you. So it could be, such on the Training Journal webinars, I separate out the question panel and the chat panel. Questions still come through the chat panel, that's fine. But it's a point about this is a specific question that you want me to see. In other technology, it could be using whiteboards, for instance, or polling and getting people to answer the polls. And as long as you've written the question and the options really well, which is difficult, you can get a sense of the group, but it's about then following up and saying, okay, 100 of you selected this, 100 of you have selected that, 50 this, and 25 that. In the chat window, explain why. Or let's use the whiteboard and maybe we're just using arrows or pens to scribble on a slide that I've designed to give me an indication of what you think. Or if you've got a webinar with less people, so 20, 25, 50, maybe even 100, let's use the whiteboard in order to answer a question. And what those kind of things can do, as long as the technology isn't a barrier, is actually it can give people a little bit more organic creativity. Even something like change of colour, change of font. Where do I click on the screen? Do I type smileys? Do I scribble a flower next to it? Or whatever it is, that all gives you information about people.
It does. And there were two things in that I wanted to pick up on. I'm really not sure about / hedging my words, because I think I don't like the WebEx red exclamation mark, because on the version I used once, I think it even said not paying attention next to the exclamation mark.
Possibly.
and I thought, well, how do you know that?
Yeah.
So and I don't know what, I now know a little bit more in that if it is the fact they've clicked on a different application, so they've clicked off that window and they're in a different application. As you said, just because what it's telling you is they've clicked on something else, it gives you no context and no idea as to why they have done that, and any meaning you should then interpret, because it's often interpreted as, this is, like you said, this is boring and so on. So I'm not sure how. I get the intent behind it. I think I get the intent behind it. I'm just not sure of the value of that as a. I think as a function.
It comes down to, again, how do you interpret it? So it's the cross arms thing. Yep, I could be making a barrier and telling you I don't like you, or I could be cold. those ththings. So as an example, I had a guy on my class years and years ago, and English was his second or third language, and it was better than my German, don't get me wrong, but from his point of view, he was struggling with the class because it was in English. So after the first session, where it was a bit like, well, he's not answering very quickly, he's always the last one with a green tick, he's always the last one in the chat window, he's always the last one to put an arrow on the screen. That's all body language. So that's a version of the crossed arms. So at the end of that, I said, oh, can you stay online? Let's have a quick chat. And it was a version of, I've noticed this, what does it mean? And he was saying, class is great, really loving it, you're great, learning loads. This is my second language and I have to interpret a lot of the words. Right, okay. At which point, obviously, I knew it was his second language. I was speaking slower. I was using simpler language anyway. So right, I need to make sure I do that even more. Yeah. And then it was a case of how to use that in the future. So we came up with, between us, we decided, okay, if I'm saying, hey, blah, blah, blah topic, green tick if you agree or you've had this experience, the understanding between us was he was happy in green tick unless he said otherwise, because I didn't want to interrupt him interpreting something just to come back and click a green tick. Yeah. And that the red exclamation point was him translating, no problem. And that if I did want him to do something, because that red exclamation point was there, I knew when he'd click back on the software because it went away. Yeah. So if there's something I wanted him to do, to unmute or to do something on the whiteboard, I'd say, hey, Stephen, or whatever his name was, Stefan, something like that. Let's bring you back to the software because our activity now is to do blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So that just gives him that cue to come back in, and all sorts of other detail and nuance in that. And other things I did, I typed words in the chat window as I used them. I did, as things were coming up, we translated them. We got comfortable as a group that he could type in, what does this word mean? And 2 or 3 people or me would explain it. It became really good because we were a group, because it was small, because I could read that digital body language, because I approached him and we discussed it, because I interpreted that hopefully correctly most of the time. And that's how it can be quite powerful. And that's just one example of one person on one course.
No, it's a really, really good example, because that it got me thinking that what I often will do if I'm facilitating if I'm facilitating a face-to-face event, you can see when people are off, and I don't mean off like disappearing, but where they're thinking, and they're either thinking about what does this mean for me, or how am I going to use it, or how am I going to apply it. And as the facilitator, you would wait for them to finish, or you gently bring them back, or whatever it is that you would need to do. And it's the same ethos, but just applied in a slightly different way in that digital or virtual world.
Yeah. So what you would do virtually is you'd present your topic or your argument, and you would say, I'm going to let you think about that for a moment whilst I do X, or whilst I have a sip of my tea. Or once you've finished thinking about that, just give a green tick to say, yeah, let's discuss it. And then you just go quiet and wait for everybody's green tick. Or if you're kind of waiting, that there's 2 or 3 still to come in, then you start saying, okay, if you've processed this in the chat window, just write a sentence about what you think. Yeah. And that gives people the time to catch up. And then you start going, okay, Bob, let's unmute and have a chat, or on the whiteboard, let's go into X amount of detail. And that's how you start building that up, because what you're doing, and I've said this before so many times, is you're deconstructing what you do face to face. Because if you understand your craft really well, you can say, well, what are the component parts that I build up in my face to face session? And therefore, let me, like a block of Lego, let me undo that and redo it with different Lego or Duplo or whatever analogy you want to use, to rebuild that in a different way. It looks different. A Duplo house and a Lego house look different, but they're both a house and they have the same function.
Oh, look at that! What a way to I almost want to think. Well, there you go. There's our wrapping up. That's the summary done.
There you go. Brand new, fresh, free for you, Phil.
Thank you. So there is one more thing I want to add, though, and
yes,
and that is that as a facilitator of online things, what the bit you were talking about in there in terms of turning off your mic or just being silent and giving people some time is such a, I find in both my personal experience and in terms of working with others, that can be a real challenge for people to get their head around. The feeling of discomfort where you put a question out, and it can be, so there's one particular question that I ask, and often it can be a minute and 15 seconds before I get a reply in the chat window. And what it says in the chat window is multiple attendees are typing. So, I know that people are contributing and they're giving a response, but because I've asked such a big question, it takes time to formulate a coherent reply, even if it has got typos, etc. in it. And I used to try and fill the gap. But what I found was actually that was becoming an interference for people, because they were trying to listen to me whilst answering my question. So now I just go quiet, and I don't even tell people I'm going to go quiet. I just ask the question and then just stay silent and just let it roll until people are back in, because they're often, if that was a real world environment, they are constructing their response or articulating their response out loud, and that's what they're doing here. I just can't hear them because they haven't got a voice in that format. And
I know we're supposed to be finishing, but I'm going to pick you up on a tiny bit of language.
Please.
Tiny bit of language there, which is, you've just said a real world environment, if this was a real world environment. And the thing is with webinars and virtual classrooms, that's why I often dislike the term virtual classroom, because it means like pretend, it is a real world environment. It's just not a face-to-face environment.
I will apologise for my indiscretion.
How dare you, Phil?
but you're right, because words matter, because what words do is they create frames. So by saying it in a real world, that pretends that the other world is, that implies that therefore the other world is pretend. So you are absolutely right to correct me on my language use. So I will accept my indiscretion.
And on the point of me being right about something for once in my life,
just while we're there, all right, so is there anything else then, Joe? Anything else that you're thinking, feeling, or want to say before we wrap up?
I've got a big smile on my face because I'm so glad we finally got to do this. We talk on and off about this kind of thing, and we've done a few things together. We've never quite got here, and now we have.
Yay!
And I've loved it, and I think it's been really interesting to talk about this topic in a slightly different way with you, because you bring your nuance and your angle to things, and I've really enjoyed a deeper dive into this topic and that slightly different angle. So thank you, and you've made me think and think about things in a different way. So thank you, Phil.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much as well. It's been wonderful, wonderful to have you on. And like you said, I'm really pleased that we managed to get there and we got the time to do it. So thank you very much for coming on, Joe. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.
All right, so before we go then, Joe, is there, if people wanted to find out more about you, if they wanted to continue the conversation, where can people get hold of you, or where can they find you?
I would love them to continue the conversation face-to-face, online, asynchronous, or any which way. So on Twitter, I am at lightbulbjoe. You can find me on my virtual classroom community if you go to lightbulbmoment.community. And I'm on LinkedIn and various other different places. I've got all sorts of resources to go and have a look at on this topic. Come and find me and have a chat and tell me whether you agree or disagree, maybe.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joe. And what I'll do is I'll put links to your Twitter handle and to the community in the show notes as well, so people have got hold of that.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, written, edited and presented by Phil Wilcox. For more information, why not visit our website, emotionatwork.co.uk. If you enjoyed the podcast, why not join the community at community.emotionatwork.co.uk, where you'll find other resources such as videos, blogs, articles, research, plus all the previous podcasts. It'd be great to hear from you. Thanks for listening.